Today, we want to give you some insights to domain-specific text analysis, which is a part of natural language processing. My name is Sunna Torge, and I am a researcher at ScaDS.AI. And I will give you this introduction together with Lena Jurkschat and Lalith Manjunath. We are interested in analyzing domain-specific texts, and these texts are out of very different domains, like, for example, engineering, financial, health, traffic, and many others. Also, the types of the documents are quite different. So we are working with newspaper articles, with scientific text data, but also with Twitter messages or product description. The languages we considered so far are English and German, but we are open for others. So if you want to analyze a bunch of text data, there are mainly two different scenarios. In the first case, you predefine some categories, and these categories may be predefined topics, maybe sentiments, or word categories like locations or person names, and many others. And then the goal is to sort our data into these predefined categories. All these tasks are so-called classification tasks, and we address these tasks with so-called supervised machine learning methods. In the other case, we want to detect so far unknown information. We want to detect hidden information in our text data. This unknown information might be relations between single documents, might also be relations between parts of the texts or sentences. Thus, we want to somehow group our data based on a definition of similarity, and this is done such that the documents within one group are very similar, and the documents which are in different groups have a very low similarity. In contrast to the first scenario I described, we do not know in advance which groups we want to find, and we also do not know the meaning of each detected group. In this case, we talk about unsupervised learning. In our projects, both of the scenarios are covered. And now, as I mentioned, unsupervised and supervised machine learning methods. Lena, you will talk about these methods in more detail.
As you see now in our research, we use supervised and unsupervised machine learning topics, and especially in the supervised, we use neural networks like BERT or GPT models for covering our problems. Mostly the supervised learning refers here to a classification task. One big difference between supervised and unsupervised is that you need here training data to train the models like BERT. And secondly, we work with unsupervised methods. So mostly this refers in our cases to clustering, where we want to group documents in special groups where we don't know what they mean or how they have to look like. For that, you will need a special distance metric and an algorithm that shows you how to cluster in general those documents. And in between of both methods, there are language models. So why are those language models so important?
In order to analyze the text data, first of all, we need a representation of the language in which the texts are written. And this representation should be machine readable and easy to process. However, a good representation of the language should comprise much more. It should reflect the specific features of the language, for example, the grammar, the style, and also semantic relations between words are also larger parts of the text. In the case of domain-specific text analysis, the language model also should cover or represent the technical terms and sometimes even the technical style, as for example in legal documents. But why there is such an effort on the research of language model generation? So if we consider human language and how we talk to each other, sometimes there are misunderstandings. And these misunderstandings, there are because words have different meanings in different contexts. Also, a machine should be able to detect these contexts, and this context might be the time, might be the author, the cultural background, and also the domain. And to reflect all these different contexts within a language model is very complex and it's not easy to realize. And this leads us to the challenging field of language model generation. And now, Lalith, perhaps you can say a few words about this, how to generate these models.
So to learn these language models from the text that you have, you can consider finding a function which takes which takes this chunk of text as input, and then the function outputs a numerical representation of the words that occur in your language model. So typically, the method that's followed is take a large chunk of text. You consider a dictionary, and for each word that occurs within the dictionary, you need to find a numerical representation that captures the meaning of the word and the context which the word would occur in your language. To do that, what you do is you consider a task, such as in the bird family, it's called the mask language modeling task, wherein you show the model in a sample text and you mask certain parts of the text, certain words that occur in the text. And then you ask the model to try and guess or predict what those words are. In the first try, the model would obviously not be able to predict the accurate words. So you teach the model how far off was its prediction. You propagate the error back to the model and make the changes within the prediction algorithm. So in turn, over the course of showing the model 100 different, 1,000 different sentences, the model eventually would learn that a particular word would be followed by another particular word. At the end of the masked language modeling task, what you obtain is a large matrix where each row of the matrix is a word that occurs in your dictionary, and the columns represent some abstract dimension or attribute that the word contains. So as an example, you could consider a word like cat, dog, man, and so on, and the columns would tell you more about the properties the word contains, such as whether it's a male or a female, the gender, whether it's royalty or not, or whether it's a human or not, and so on and so forth. This large matrix also contains certain nice properties, basically it encapsulates the knowledge within the language. So as an example, these vectors that we obtain from the language model contain properties such as similarity. So you could see that the word man and woman are on similar distances from the word king and queen. So this basically encapsulates the meaning that man and woman, the gender meaning between the man and woman and the king and queen. And also a few other subtleties, such as the context. So the word mouse can mean multiple things. It can mean the animal mouse, or it could mean the gadget mouse. So the language models also need to encapsulate this subtlety depending on the context in which the word is used. So these models that are trained are often pre-trained on a large chunk of data, and then these can be used again for other researchers. In practice, what happens is you get this large matrix where the rows are every possible word that occurs in the human language, and the columns are around 200 or 400, depends on what dimension you choose. So this leads to a large matrix which requires enormous compute time and large data to actually compute. So in practice, what we researchers, what we do is use a pre-trained model which was trained on a large chunk of data on which contains numerous topics, and apply it to a specific domain. So this is called transfer learning. So Lena, how do you use these word representations within your model?
For my unsupervised clustering task, it's important that we can represent our documents in a proper way. So I worked here with a bunch of theses from the engineering domain, which were all in German available. And the researchers, the researchers from the engineering domain asked which topics were covered in the data or in the documents, and which topics have been edited through the years. And for that, we have to group the documents in a specific way. And for that, I've started with a simple point. I've used the titles of the thesis and used the language model called BERT to get the representations out of it, those vectors that Lalith and Sunna presented before. And then with those vectors, we can use a clustering algorithm to get our clusters. So we're at the point where we have our clusters, or so-called groups. And now it's the second part to analyze those groups. One can count the words in the clusters you received, just to get an overview which words occur within each cluster. And another thing you can do also is to calculate the distances between the clusters. So specifically, you take every document in one cluster and calculate the distance to the points in the other clusters, and then you sum up the distances, and so you have all overall cluster distances. And those words, those common words and those cluster distances, one can visualize, and that's what I want you to show. As you can see here, the big colored dots represent our clusters, and the smaller dots with the words around them represent the words, the common words of those clusters, which overlap from cluster to cluster sometimes. There was especially one cluster which is called a noise cluster. So actually this isn't a real cluster. It's just the group of documents which we weren't able to get into one group. So as you can see, there are very general words like example in them or simulation. And what we also can see are the distances between the clusters. So as you can see, cluster 1 and cluster 5 are far away from each other. So we and the experts from the engineering domain and from the linguistic domain maybe have to have now the challenge to see if the clusters we have are meaningful and if they are semantically really that far away. So we have to evaluate manually if the clusters are useful. And this is one of the main challenges in clustering, that you do not have sure evaluation metrics. So Lalith, maybe it's easier for you in the supervised learning task when it comes to evaluation.
Although I have labeled data in my research, it's often challenging because of the reasons that I'll mention here. So the research that I focus on is called the domain-specific name entity recognition. So basically, named entity recognition means that given a chunk of text or passage or phrase, you need to detect if there is an entity and what type of entity that occurs within the text. So you could detect whether if it's a given word in a sentence is if it's a name of a person or name of an organization or time of the year and so on. So so in this case, I consider the domain of traffic related data. These data are collected from various Twitter messages, news articles, RSS feeds, and so on, and fed into the BERT model to obtain the word representations for the words that occur within the dataset. The representations that I obtain from the BERT model are then used to analyze the features that the BERT model produces. So depending on the different features that the BERT model produces, the bi-LSTM model eventually learns to detect whether a given word is, if it's an entity or not, and if it is an entity, what kind of entity is it. So given a text, it would eventually tell you how many different entities are there and what kind of entities are there. This would be shown in the given demo. For the demo, you can see one example here, which is a short sentence, and the model, if you give the model this as an input, the model would detect different entities that occur in the model. Here, the model performs as expected, and it detects the different entities, such as different locations that occur in the sentence. This is another example, which in this case is a bit longer than the previous example. You can see that the model detects entities accurately in this in the case where the length of this example is also large. In this case, you also see that there are few entities that are missed, such as the date and the distance. So this is because the model did not have enough training examples to learn that this particular token or this particular word is actually a date or a distance. The last and final example is a particularly difficult example that the model could not detect entities from. You can see that the model inaccurately says that the service plan entity is a person, whereas it's actually an organization, and Valencia is detected as miscellaneous entity when in actuality it is a place, location. For the model to accurately predict this, it would require a lot more examples to show that Valencia is in reality a place and not a miscellaneous entity. So as you can see from the demo, that there are a few cases where the entities are not detected accurately. This is mainly this is the major challenge in domain-specific analysis, because the lack of example poses a challenge wherein the model cannot learn enough from the data that we have. So if we have more examples, the model would eventually learn to detect the different entities more accurately, and the performance of the model would increase.
So we gave you an introduction to domain-specific text analysis and presented you a few projects. So you've learned something about named entity recognition in German in the traffic and industry-related domain. Here we used supervised machine learning methods. And you also heard something about the analysis of scientific text data of the engineering domain. And here we use unsupervised machine learning methods. In all of our projects, we face a lack of domain-specific data. Sometimes we also face a lack of language-specific data or task-specific data. These challenges we address with so-called transfer learning methods. We use large language models trained on a very large corpus of data. We also say pre-trained by other groups, and then we adapt them to our needs and use them for our purposes. So before I conclude, I would like to make a last remark. Domain-specific text analysis is an interdisciplinary work. So it's not enough to have expertise in computer science, but you also need to have expertise in the specific domain and also in the linguistic part. Thus, our work is a collaboration between different departments, and here I would like to thank Bernd Grüber from the engineering department and Simon Meyer-Vieracker from the linguistic department of TU Dresden. And here I want to thank you for your attention, and now we are open for questions.